So once again we step into the void that is the insanity of the 41st millennium, although the word insanity is perhaps more applicable here than usual. Immediately breaking your immersion, this was not my planned video for this week, but I have a lot coming up and so things are being juggled around, so rest assured various things are coming up soon. Please be sure to check in on my community tab also here on the channel, as I'll be trying to post there with regularity and updates. It's located here. Now, previously we were considering all of the obscure concepts for the Emperor of Mankind, origin and otherwise that may have surfaced over time, maybe things I've thought of, maybe things that you guys have thought about too. And in a galaxy as clouded and confusing as it is in M41, it's fair to say that any could be applicable. How do I imagine these greatly heretical speculations coming to pass? Well, just off the top of my head, I envision chattering masses of hive workers waiting in line for their daily shift. They whisper this month's hot rumour that is supposedly the truth from Terra itself, heard from someone's cousin's best mate who belongs to a guild travelling off-world. Hive nobles sit around in darkened snugs high atop the city, smoking off-world cigars and discussing dangerously suspicious papers acquired by the family's rogue trader exploits deep in compromised territory, and which speculate about the Emperor himself. An inquisitor pores over ancient tomes thousands of years old, written by a previous inquisitor of the Ordo and who apparently felt the burning desire to put pen to paper before they expired. The list goes on and on. Because there are innumerable possibilities that have pinged in all our brains over the years, many of the more common ones we've all seen by now, but as before, it's just fun to imagine how far can you push it. How plausible can concepts about the Emperor remain, a being who is at the point of M41 so detached from the figure who walked abroad in the world of mankind 10,000 years previous that few can really comprehend just what he is now, and even fewer likely come close to guessing his actual origin and purpose. We likely will never know with certainty. As noted last time though, you were all extremely active in contributing ideas, and so this time I decided to throw in at least one of your speculations. If you have more that are included today, feel free to drop them in the comments below, or if you have an idea for another speculative area of 40k you want me to cover, drop that below as well. Think outside the box, break the boundaries. So again today we're talking specifically about speculative origins and meanings of the Emperor, one of which I did get a little bit rambly and carried away with. And as always, if you enjoy this channel, please remember to hit the likes for the like god, it greatly helps me in the channel, plus all of us must appease our Lord and Saviour, the Leviathan algorithm god. So with that, let our speculations begin. Now we know that the Emperor knew of the demon known as the First Murder. It has another name, but honestly, I'm not 100% sure on its pronunciation. It's Dracnian. Anyway, this demon was formed at the moment one human killed another for reasons other than pure survival. And moreover, it's believed they may have been brothers, or at least loosely related. And this of course goes back to the concept about why the heresy was so empowering for the forces of chaos, and that is because of the abhorrent nature of the betrayal at hand. These are the actions that create the most powerful resonance in the warp. It's not so much the brutality of an act or the pain involved for victims or sacrifices, although these do resonate, as of course many traitor Astartes learned. It's just that unfortunately these base actions require monumental effort to break and really attract any attention. The more powerfully disturbing actions for the warp are those which break moral boundaries, that destroy the definitions of humanity as we understand it. So the First Murder was not really about murder. It was abhorrent in the sense that it crossed moral, ethical boundaries for the first time, and in so doing created a powerful demonic entity that by M41 is known as a very old or ancient being, although again we get into all that strange time stuff about how can a demon be old or ancient by the parameters we understand the warp to operate under. Anyway, so this demon is very ancient. The Emperor himself recognizes it as such and seems almost concerned by its presence during the war in the Webway toward the end of the heresy. And this is where the Emperor bids famously Ra, one of his custodies, to sacrifice himself in stopping this terrifying demon of the First Murder. And moreover, it appears that the Emperor knew that this moment was coming and had been essentially grooming Ra for this moment, mentally preparing him for what was required. Also, incidentally, this First Murder demon, Dracnian, is supposedly bound or trapped within the sword of Abaddon the Despoiler. Now, that's interesting, and there is a little more to that story, but it's pretty irrelevant to this right now. Here's the thought though. Regardless of how the Emperor himself was created, regardless of what he is, in that sense of is he a powerful psyker or an amalgamation of souls, that's for other speculations. But the concept here is, what if the Emperor is this first murderer? What if he essentially is the first human to cast the stone into the warp? We know from the Emperor's lucid dream states that he killed others in his youth, in his ancient past, before humanity came into the modern age, and that he seemingly could do this using his powers before he really understood what he was himself. Now, keeping on that point, couldn't we consider that the Emperor committed this terrible murder at a time out of uncontrolled rage or mistaken explosion of his powers? Maybe he couldn't control himself, and this then set into motion a chain of events that would create a powerful resonance in the warp, and that everything since then has been an attempt to repair the damage. That the Emperor is in effect some kind of convoluted quantum leap gone wrong, that he's trying to right what once went wrong, but keeps making things progressively worse and more complex. Not to mention just humanity drilling down on things getting worse and worse over time. I think it's interesting to consider less from the position of just what the Emperor is, but this is considering more about his motivations. That he of course understood early on that actions in reality had a devastating and disastrous impact into the warp. For as powerful as the immortal beings we refer to as the Perpetuals are, they either seem to be disinterested by mortal humans, presumably because they consider themselves to exist on something of another level comparative to ordinary mortals, and that they're just generally somewhat disinterested in the limited scope afforded by ordinary human lives. They ascend to this higher plane of being where they see things in the grand, longer order of things. It's also been noted that some Perpetuals participated in and were involved in key aspects of humanity's past, but failed. In fact, it's worth mentioning the entire situation with the Emperor and Olp, the Tower of Babel or Babel and the Annuncia, and some of those things are really still kind of unknowns. But for everyone else, the basic point to be made is that in the past times of humanity, ancient human history, the Emperor never seemed as powerful as he does in M30. Why is that? Is it because he didn't want to be seen as a demigod who could crush entire worlds? The answer is likely yes. We know he took on powerful roles, but he probably was less crushed by the failures of human civilization at that time and wanted or expected to just give humanity a chance to redeem itself later. And this seems to have been the perspective of most Perpetuals, to allow ordinary humans to chart their own path forward. So most likely in the past, the Emperor and other Perpetuals had these similar beliefs. It's just that as they went along, they became divergent. The Emperor was more ancient, more powerful. But at some point he snaps and decides he needs to take control of the reins. But even that is a bit of a suspect question, as we will come to with something else later. But what he does realise is that he needs the right moment to do so. Now, speculating on why he chose that period post-Age of Strife, that's something else we're going to talk about later on. And it also comes into discussing elements about Malcador as well. But this idea of casting the first stone, disturbing the warp, from what we understand, and again, this kind of comes back to my Dark Origins series. Again, I know I've got to do the last one there, and that is on my to-do list. Essentially the idea that the first murder, this first crossing of a boundary, has a far bigger impact into the warp than it would do so later on. And that's why by the time you get to M30 and M41, you need basically entire planets being annihilated to really grab the attention of the beings in the warp. Whereas back in the ancient times, it really didn't require quite so much, and also there was a lot of traumatic, horrifying things occurring on Earth Terra at that time. Now of course people always say, well, what about the war in heaven? Again, go take a look at my Dark Origins series and I do explain that. But coming back, the point though is that the Emperor appears to, either by choice or possibly just his own limited abilities, maybe he was less powerful in the past. Again, these are things we can speculate off of that. And again, we will talk about Malcador. Somehow did he empower the Emperor? Did the Emperor only gain immense power later on if he travelled to Moloch, etc, etc. This idea of the Emperor casting the first stone, it relies upon, in my mind anyway, the idea that he was unable to do anything about it at that time. That he was in fact more powerful than ordinary humans, as in he has some psychic ability, but maybe not too much, and he's still a level above other Perpetuals. I think this makes sense to me, and maybe it was that he didn't really even fully comprehend the enormity of the actions that he took until much, much later, millennia later perhaps, because again, however he came into being, maybe he didn't really understand what he was until much later on. Because as the quote about the first murder states, it becomes a name that means nothing in any language spoken by any species, living or dead, a name that carries meaning only in the strangled, misfiring thoughts of humans breathing their last breaths, in that precious and terrifying moment when their spirits are caught between one realm and the next. The name of a creature, a demon born from the cold rage of one traitorous soul in one treacherous second. Its name is the deed itself, the first murder and the death rattle that followed. In the creature's shrieking journey across the warp, it touches the minds of every human who ever was and will ever be, from the long dead to those yet to be born. The demon is tied to the species with such primal intimacy that every man, woman and child knows its caress, deep in their blood and bones, even if they know nothing of its name. Now the implication is that this first murder ties humanity, tethers them to a terrible fate of murder and slaughter, and essentially causing humanity's doom. And that's our first thought for today. Was the first murder of the Emperor before he was the Emperor, and did it set him and us on a path of frenzied reparation, attempting to put Pandora back into the box, as it were? So then we come to something that I always think of as the Destroyer theory. This is less an origin story and more of a what was he doing story. I guess you could call it something more like the origins of the Emperor and the Imperium. I've not really seen this noted anywhere, but undoubtedly somebody somewhere has had the same thought, because it's not that complicated. Essentially, it's the concept that the Emperor passively and then later actively was an extremely destructive force for humanity during the Golden Age. This idea also plays somewhat into the next two concepts as well. So what I've often considered is, not what has the Emperor done up to the point of the Dark Age of technology, but what hasn't he done? For example, you've heard me before say, why would the massive secure vault that is the Palace on Terra, Malcador's huge vault of knowledge, but why did they never bother to store up plenty of STC, or just keep one active STC? I mean, the Votan managed it, some rambling gangers on a hive world managed it, but not the Emperor. That's strange, isn't it? Very strange. One might even say suspicious. Also contradictory to the next speculations we'll come to. Whenever there are speculations about the Emperor's origins coming later in human history, even toward the end of the Golden Age, the one thing people love to trot out is, well, he's referenced as being very actively present in ancient human history, also the Void Dragon. Sure, all good points. So why is it that the Emperor decided that he needed to be present during that Tower of Babel incident? I guess because he knew how dangerous Enuncia were potentially, and also the dangers of Catan shards, all fair reasons to exert power. Yet, we always are told that the Emperor's grand plan was basically to lead us into this enlightened, rational society, which would then starve the beings in the warp, bring stability back to humanity, or in a very basic sense, anyway. Then of course his idea that if this all looked a little bit dodgy, he could fall back into the webway and hide out starving chaos again. Okay, well that's all fine. Except that all very much sounds like the Golden Age to me. Wasn't the Golden Age this period of technological worship and stability, the abolition of mythology, science being the new temple to worship? That all really sounds like the Emperor's plan. So here's the thing, with all of the Emperor's foresight, and admittedly it doesn't seem to be all-seeing, but nonetheless, he couldn't see something as disastrous as the collapse of the Golden Age coming? And even then, when it did come, what did he do? We have never heard any vision or reference to the Emperor leading the good fight. He's this all-powerful, massively superhuman psyker, the most powerful in all humanity, but you know, he just couldn't best those pesky robots and the AI. It all seems very, very suspect to me. I think that what happened is the Emperor knew exactly what was coming, but he decided to sit on his hands, to sit back and let humanity destroy itself, because he knew that perhaps the humanity of the Golden Age was a little too enlightened for him, a little too rational, and it would be very difficult to overcome the power of humanity at that time, even with his immense powers. Of course, that is very dependent on how powerful he was at that time. Maybe he wasn't that powerful. Maybe, as we all speculate upon, he only became powerful enough to obliterate people from existence with a thought later on. Maybe all of that came post-Dark Age of technology. But again, in terms of his foresight, I've always felt that the Emperor doesn't see one singular solid, set-in-stone path forward. Similarly to the Elder, he kind of sees options, possibilities, and sometimes he can kind of feel this out more solidly than at other times, and generally speaking, he can kind of see a path forward, or he can kind of choose a path forward. I don't think that necessarily means that we're operating on multiple timelines, multiple realities. It's more just paths, and there are choices to be made along the way. But again, that kind of can contradict also my thoughts about how time works in 40k, etc, etc. So it's not very clear. But I think what we can understand is that the Emperor does have the ability to have foresight, and given the length of time that the collapse of humanity in the Golden Age took, given how disastrous it was, it's just not believable that he couldn't see it coming at all. So the reason I think of it as the Destroyer theory is because the Emperor in this speculation was content to just sit back and watch everything burn down, because he knew that humanity would slide into a catastrophic state of downfall, and in its heavily weakened state he would be able to remold it as he saw fit to do, and thus a despicable, almost evil act of inaction. By not choosing to get involved, he was in effect choosing the side which caused the destruction and downfall of humanity from its Golden Age. Now, why did the Emperor not choose to save some of that tech from the Golden Age? I suppose we might consider that things at the time were too chaotic. Maybe he genuinely just didn't have the means, because who knows where or what he was up to at that time. Also though, maybe he didn't want to store too much technology. Maybe for his plans, what was in his head were enough, because of course the true power is knowledge, and the more ignorant your peon class humans are kept, the far easier it is for them to be manipulated into thinking you're this superhuman god. This can also slide into the Emperor very obviously knowing that by making himself the biggest man in the world and being covered in gold now, all the while telling people he definitely 100% is not a god, whilst actively performing miracles in front of them, and then saying, just a reminder, I'm not a god, wink. The Emperor, I suppose, arguably, would not have been able to achieve or set in motion the beliefs of humanity so strongly during the Golden Age, because people would have laughed him out of the room. As opposed to in the ignorant darkness of a collapsed galactic civilization where people are just looking for some possibility of survival, the chances of people worshipping an all-powerful gigantic super being who promises all the things you want to see, well, then that's going to be a significant increase in your being hailed a god. It seems to be more on the cards in that scenario. And there's really little more to add here because it's quite a straightforward premise. The Emperor destroyed humanity, not directly, because he just didn't want it to be saved. He may lament it at face value, but his goals were on a much more grand timescale, and for his future to come to pass, the zenith time of humanity could not continue. Within this idea, of course, there remain the even more suspect speculations of what triggered the downfall of the Golden Age. We know it was something which occurred with the AI and the Men of Iron. This is often presumed to be because they became so advanced that they were to all intents and purposes conscious beings indistinguishable from humans, so much so that they could be corrupted by chaos. So the million-dollar question is, did humanity fall, or was it pushed? Did the Emperor sit back and witness the ravages of chaos and think, I really need to devise a foolproof way for this to not happen again, namely outlawing AI and ruling humanity like a god? Or did his dreams of becoming an all-powerful emperor come first, and the Emperor led a few AI astray during the Golden Age, pointed them in the direction of the warp, and let the nature of the Immaterium then just take its course? So to follow on directly from all that dark age of technology thinking, I decided to combine two ideas into one section as they moderately overlap. But I apologise in advance because this one gets a little convoluted and a lot rambly. But in my defence, I was putting this all down at 4:30 AM after a long day, so cut me some slack. One of the core driving forces for speculation about the Emperor is of course the ongoing question about the relationship link between Malcador and the Emperor. Malcador, the Regent of Terror, is, as we explored previously, also known as the Sigillite, the last of the great orders upon Old Earth, who were the guardians of knowledge and more importantly culture. But as we see with Malcador, they also are seemingly aware of humanity's ability to become immensely powerful psykers. And what I mean by that is obviously Malcador being very powerful as a psyker himself. Now as to when specifically this order of Sigillites originates is not clear, nor is much of their background, but according to Horus, as we learned before, they did commit massive atrocities at one point in time. Now a long-term and pretty direct conclusion many have made in the past is, did Malcador create the Emperor? I'd planned to cover this actually in this video, but as I said before, if people put down their own thoughts in the comments, that I would cover a couple of those. So a big thanks to all of you for that last time. But this one comes from Eldrino, who rightly points out that this concept about Malcador and the Emperor has been around for a while because it's a fairly logical assemblage of narrative pieces, although it does require some subjective interpretations of lore, which, as I've already said, I'm pretty open to within the context of diegetic 40k lore information, and especially if it's meta-diegetic. Remembering that meta-diegetic simply means a dream or, say, a story about some person, place or time being told by a character within the verse, because this stuff is wildly subjective. We can barely trust our own memories, let alone the word of others, because who knows what their agenda is, or if they're being manipulated in some way. And this is especially true of perpetuals and in general characters within the world of 40k. So meta-diegetic, not particularly trustworthy in my opinion. The diegetic, as in real-time situations from the character's point of view, generally more trustworthy, especially if witnessed by multiple others to back up their claim. So in the comments of the last vid, Eldrino noted that I would have thought Luton would have touched upon the Malcador created the Emperor theory in the Wanderer section of that video. And they state that the theory goes that the Emperor was not born but created sometime in the 27th century by the Sigillites in an attempt to create the perfect human. Humanity was just coming out of the dark times and the destruction caused by the Men of Iron. The Sigillites tried to recapture the power of humanity, not through AI or mechanical means like before, but through biological excellence. Taking all they knew of perpetuals and the various mutations of humanity, foresight, great strength, psychic powers, they attempted to forge the perfect human. Malcador leads this project along with other perpetuals, and whilst they fail time and time again, they learn from each mistake. Information would go on to help create the Astartes and others. It was only through the use of an alien device gathered before the Dark Times and the consumption of said device that the Emperor came to be, and would explain why only one being like this was created. However, much like a Frankenstein, Malcador was blinded by his hubris in his vision that he created a perfect being. But what perfect man would allow him or itself to be controlled by a lesser man? When Malcador beheld his creation, he was crushed psychically by the force of this new creation. The Emperor was a perfect being and he knew it. He saw a golden path where all of humanity were on his level, and he would make that future come into being, even if it must be by force. That's why all the Perpetuals, save Malcador, abandon or plot against the Emperor later on. They see the monster they helped create and fear what future he would deem acceptable. It's also why anyone who has seen the Emperor's true face is always disturbed by him, because for all his golden aura and benevolence, the Emperor is as alien to humanity as humans are to other species. He is an artificial being whose humanity was burned up in his own birth creation. Now obviously a few things to think about there, and a few ways to look at it. The biggest problem is, of course, as I've often said, if there is one or two individuals who reference in detail past situations, it's believable they could be manipulated. When it comes to the Emperor though, we do have quite a lot of reference to him throughout the lore, which establishes him as being active and present prior to the end of the Dark Age of technology, the Golden Age. Now, at the same time, if you wanted to do some reaching, it's certainly within the Emperor's power to manipulate people's minds, to reorder, create artificial memories for them. In fact, we have actively seen him do this when he blanked some of his Primarch's memories about their prior visits to Moloch because he didn't want them to discover that location, which ultimately failed. But this idea about psychers being able to partition sections of their mind, this is a common thing which occurs throughout many of the narratives in 40k. And you even see, for example, chief librarians of the Ultramarines sending sectioned pieces of themselves on quests whilst they're on other side of the galaxy and so forth. So the Emperor is far more powerful than, say, an Ultramarines librarian. So the idea that he could do this in real time with different people, it's very plausible. At the same time, of course, if you want to step back from the immersed world of 40k, you have to think, well, is that a little bit too convoluted? And really the question then would be, what would really be the point of all that? Why would he not want to, say, just blank other people's memories of him, but to artificially make them believe he existed throughout human history? I guess one might suggest maybe it was necessary in order to gather support of other perpetuals, except that most perpetuals seem to not really support the Emperor, or if they did, they soon had second thoughts about it. So that's a little problematic, because you've got many key perpetuals, notably Erda, Ol-P, who really reference him pretty extensively. You also have the Emperor's own meta-diegetic memory phases, where he shows past situations to people like Ra of the Custodes about his, early life and stuff. Why would that be necessary, especially with somebody like Ra, who ends up just dead and not really able to speak to anybody? Why would he do that if it wasn't true? One might suggest that this were necessary, supposedly to create the illusion of him being this grand, epoch-traversing super being who has only the betterment of humanity at heart. Except, again, what would really be the point of that? Because in the end, he doesn't seem to really rely on what others think about him. He just crushes anybody who opposes his will and then just does what he wants anyway. So it doesn't really seem to fit too well to it being necessary for him to actually convince people otherwise. Now, one other way to look at this could be the fact that the Emperor is in fact so powerful of a psyker that he somehow is similar to a Chaos God, except that he is of the Materium. You might say, well, how can there be gods in the Materium? Well, there are, the Catan, and they even claim to be more powerful than the beings of the Warp, if they were able to just become one unified state again. The Catan see the Warp as a total anathema to their goals and seek the closure of the rift and the separation permanently of the Warp and material space, just if you're wondering. So the Emperor is immensely powerful, far beyond any other human, to the point that he really isn't human, he's really more like a god. And I know that troubles people who are in the camp of, he is just a man, but come on now. So this idea that his exact origin somewhat transcends time, it's plausible, and we risk going off again into the whole how does time function in 40k. I've got my opinion about that. I think the lore itself honestly hasn't fully decided, because even in newer material it's often contradictory. But sometimes it does get touched upon when, say, in Belisarius Call's great work, the Emperor speaks to Ezekiel Sedaine, who has not yet become Call, but the Emperor speaks to him as Call. So Sedaine is confused by this, but the Emperor speaks to him as Call. And Sedaine is confused by this, but the Emperor notes that Sedaine is basically his name for now. So we might conclude that the Emperor is just seeing into the future. Except it gets a little more complex when Call says, when is this? To which the Emperor replies, every moment, no moment, a moment gone. Nothing ever passes, not truly, but goes only beyond notice. Ah, said Call, or Sedaine, you're free of this, is that so? No one is free of time, said the Emperor, not even me. As long-lived as I am, it is ironic that the one thing I lack is time. And the Emperor frowned. There is never enough. Again, without getting too bogged down in time, I think suffice to say there's room for speculation that the Emperor need not necessarily have originated in the past in order for himself to cast a version of himself into that time. Still, this idea that Malcador, or more correctly his Sigillite order, created the Emperor, it's not particularly tidy, but it is an interesting thought, this idea that in the aftermath of the collapse of the Golden Age, an order of humans who saw the writing on the wall combined all the power and knowledge of humanity at that time and forged the ultimate super being, the sum total of AI and psychic development to that point. Except that something went a little wrong. The Emperor was not beholden to the order, or was he? Again, we could go off on a whole other thing about who really was guiding the ship at that time. Was it the Emperor, or was it Malcador all along? I do like the concept for a few reasons, in that it's interesting to then see the creation of the Primarchs, which notably are also created down in the vaults of the Sigillite Order, where they seemingly have these laboratories and the capability to do so. But perhaps by the time this came to be, they were then lacking the technology and materials to bring them into being as powerful as the Emperor. Again, I've noted this is why I speculatively believe the Emperor travelled to Moloch not to empower himself, but to empower the Primarchs. So not unlike so many of these ideas, it's a little bit messy, but it's still a fun idea to play around with. And then we come to what is basically an adjacent concept to that of the Sigillites creating the Emperor. Instead, the overall idea is that the Emperor of Man is a relic from the Golden Age or Dark Age of technology for humanity. So if we can push the puzzle pieces around on the table of my brain, let's see what picture we can make here. Again, this is not a groundbreaking idea, it's a concept that I think many could have come to on their own when we consider how far humanity has fallen since the Golden Age and how much knowledge has been lost. It is in fact incomprehensible how much technology humanity has lost. And I think the recent discovery of the power of the Votan in terms of just the lore, it helps us to gain just a fractional hint at how much has been lost. So is the idea of the Emperor being a relic of the Golden Age plausible? Well, again, you just come back around to the idea that should someone choose to do so, they could shake up and remap the entire framework of the 40k verse, using the explanation of some ancient Necron device distorting reality, the Emperor himself casting some powerful psychic veil, maybe Malkador is still alive and has just regenerated somehow as a perpetual. What about the King in Yellow and all that jazz? Again, it goes on and on and on. Now, we already talked though about things seen through the eyes of others, the diegetic, meta-diegetic, and how these things can be subjectively untrustworthy, along with, say, visions given to us from the Emperor's point of view. So again now, what about those perpetuals? These figures who have crossed millennia, if not all of human history. They tend to tether the Emperor to specific pieces of information. Well, the thing is, they themselves note that it becomes difficult to really recall or place themselves in past memories because so much time has passed, which is very understandable. I mean, really think about that for a moment. Most of us find it difficult remembering with clarity our own lives, which span something like 60 to 80 years. Imagine if you were essentially not more than an ordinary human, because perpetuals are mostly ordinary, except they may have some psychic powers and this very extended lifespan. But they're not Primarchs or Mechanicus. They can't recall with quantum precision every singular moment of their lives. It all blurs together. And so we might imagine if you had lived for 1,000 years, for 10,000 years, how would that feel? I think honestly, it would be insanely confusing. You would undoubtedly recall key events that for whatever reason were burned into your memory. But even then, consider how our own memories are manipulated over time, painted in, say, brighter colours than they were at that moment in time. We can rarely trust our own memories, and often these will blur together with dreams and misremembered things. Your own reality becomes very, very clouded. So we really have little ability to recall what had taken place with accuracy. And that's before you get to things and figures like John Grammaticus, Ol-P, the stuff that they had to do, the forces at play against them. So the Perpetuals are a tricky one. They sometimes seem very sure of events and figures, especially the Emperor, and in part, maybe that's why they seem and seek to live these mundane, ordinary lives so they can cling on to the important memories and let everything else just blur into banality, to basically give themselves some marked framework to live by. Also, of course, so they can just avoid getting entangled in all the Emperor's nonsense, which tends to seemingly be the primary cause. Now, I know, because already today I've heard several times the chairs moving in the corners of the dissenting audience who are now furiously typing, well, Luton, if nothing's for certain, I can just decide anything is true. So what's the point? Are you going to tell us this is no canon again, Luton? Well, I was, but maybe not today. But it's a fair point. Yes, it's true. We have to have some certainty, because otherwise things just become the warp and pure, unadulterated chaos. We have to have a measure of trust in the basic framework of the 40k reality, which for me, I would say is somewhere between post-unification, post-heresy. I don't think I've really decided on that just yet, but somewhere in there has to be a kind of, established timeline to begin from. Because personally, anything before unification is very wildly open to interpretation. Why? Well, for one, we have next to no records or references to this time within the context of 40k. Very fragmented, very subjective. And secondly, when people begin to encounter the Emperor early on, he very deliberately and actively disguises himself, calls himself other things. He tries to evade really being who he is, which really points to the interpretation of him prior to becoming a golden super being as pretty sketchy and unreliable. 40k for me is largely about gradations of truth. Also, as you know, I personally try to view 40k more from an internal perspective than external. I like to look at things from those who exist in the galaxy of 40k than outside. It's just how I like to see it. As I've noted this many times, it's why some of my videos will say one thing and others might contradict. But often it's actually deliberate because I'm just trying to see these things from different viewpoints. Anyway, rambled on a little bit there. The point is, although we do have some reference to the Dark Age of technology, what do we really know before that? We know our history now, of course, we know about the stellar exodus and all this kind of stuff, but other than that, it's really just lucid dreams, accounts from some perpetuals, scraps of paper and references, the occasional character who references some ancient time, encounters with an old AI who tend to be pretty pissed off and don't really want to stick around to have a chat. With all that in mind, we come to this other idea, that the Emperor did exist during the Golden Age, but that he might have been secret, or some kind of ultimate weapon, not created by the Sigillites, just a product of that time. Simply put, how do we know that the Emperor isn't just a broken piece of the aftermath of the Dark Age of technology? How do we know that? Well, we don't. We can't know that. But but we can point to references, dreams, memories of individuals in the 40k verse. But then how reliable is all that? If you were an Imperial researcher in M41 and some oddball crazy person on a distant hive world told you that they'd lived for tens of thousands of years and remembered the days of the old Emperor and so on, they'd probably end up being executed or made into a servitor. Now, in thinking about characters making references which are contradictory or unreliable, yes, we do have figures who note about the Emperor's past and so on, but there are fragments which point in other directions also. One such is Surprise from Master of Mankind. Very early on in the novel, we see Valdor executing Koja Zu, whose son was incidentally the aforementioned member of the Emperor's Custodes, Ra. Now, Zu has this incredibly powerful quote that is near enough unseen anywhere else in the lore of 40k, and the fact it's spoken to Valdor raises, of course, many possibilities. It goes as follows. Koja Zu's lip curled. Emperor. How I loathe that title. Valdor. He is the ruler of this world and the master of our species. No title is more appropriate. She bared her teeth in an expression too ugly and defiant to be a smile. Have you ever considered just what kind of creature you serve? Yes, the dark eye stared on. Have you? The master of mankind. She shook her head, feeling the welcome flare of righteousness. He isn't even human. Minister Zu, the Golden Warrior, made a warning of her name, one she didn't heed. Does he even breathe? She demanded. Tell me that, Custodian. Have you ever heard him breathe? He is a relic left over from the Dark Age, a weapon left out of its box, now running rampant. Now, for one thing, why would Zu bother to mention this before their impending death? What would they gain? They have nothing to gain. It's not clear why specifically Zu has this observation when so many others have the opposite either. She seems to hold an active disdain for the Emperor, and this is more typical during the end of the unification before the Crusade. Humanity, especially on Terra, seemed far more uncertain and cynical about who the Emperor was, not least because he had just brutally crushed them all into submission. But it's particularly interesting because it demonstrates to us perhaps these were the last moments of the true humanity. Everything past this point becomes the Emperor's version of humanity, intentional or not. The galaxy becomes his domain and humanity becomes his clay to mould and crush as he wishes. The last moments during the unification of Terra are also the final gasps of humanity as we see the last lights of free thinking extinguished. After this, all who oppose the Emperor are just brutally crushed and exterminated. Still, this doesn't explain why Zu considers the Emperor to be some inhuman monster. Where did they get this information from, and why? Why are they so adamant about it? And for me, just to not be a total hypocrite, I should point out obviously this is one random individual's perspective and we should take it with a large pinch of salt. But clearly there were many others during unification who began to have second thoughts, who began to question, who is this Emperor? What is he all about? Why did he have a habit of dictating the rules and then moving the goalposts? People began to be resentful at seeing someone who appeared, if to not be a demigod then a god, being invincible, untouched by blights that afflict mortals, immune to entropy. It all felt very suspicious. So Zu, not dissimilarly to millions of others, were lied to, sold this promise of a new human civilization, but would ultimately realise the truth, that humans are not the ones leading this new empire. There is only one leader, and anything that stands in the way is battered into submission. This idea, though, of a relic left over from the Dark Age, a weapon left out of its box running rampant, what does it really mean? Well, for one, I think it could just mean that the Emperor is not a perpetual in the truest sense. I personally still question just even what a perpetual is. I mean, it's not something that's well defined at all in the lore. It's very loosely attributed to a human who can at a base level not die. They can, if you want to call it such, reincarnate. Sometimes it seems as if it's reanimation. Perpetuals do seem able to die still a true death, just as demons can, just as the Emperor gave Horus a true death at the end of the heresy. This is why Horus was not just banished back to the warp. He ceases to exist in any form. He's been nullified from existence totally. And this is what occurs when a demon is given a true death, something they fear more than anything else, and it's why they especially fear Grey Knights. Perpetuals, though, we know they can seemingly be artificially and naturally created, but what about the Emperor? Could he be, as suggested, a product of the Dark Age of technology? Well, humour me here, because this is where I want to blend this former idea about Malkador creating the Emperor and this idea of him being a relic of the Dark Age of technology. But first, Remember how I speculated back long ago in the War in Heaven that the Eldar mythology speaks about these immense weapons used to fight the Necron tier, and I'm summarising this very quickly, but that through millions of years in Eldar mythology development, those weapons became the pantheon of Eldar gods. Now the interesting thing is that we know Eldar can detach and use souls to power their weapons of war, or at least they used to, and this is why some of their Wraith constructs require souls to be attached, not just one pilot. I believe this is how their ancient war weapons that were fought on a whole other scale functioned also, that they could detach souls to use that psychic power within them to power up these massive weapons of war in heaven scale destruction, powerful enough to say, shatter the Catan. Now that knowledge seems to have been lost to the Eldar, and again I just want to remind this is my speculative sense of things. But I do think that this is how those constructs functioned, because it's near enough established that the Eldar could detach and use their souls in some other form at that time. Of course, back then there was no threat of Slanesh, and the warp was a more calm place where the Eldar bathed their souls in, tethering this massive weaponry to the warp to use its presumably limitless power at that time. So it was very, very different. But my point being, humanity of the Golden Age was insanely advanced, so advanced it's said to have made other advanced races like the Eldar have second thoughts about entangling themselves with humanity of this time. And we get glimpses of that immense technology from time to time. There's that Mechanicus ship which actually fires a weapon which moves an Eldar ship fractionally back in time so that it's co-occupying the same space, thereby causing an absolutely cataclysmic explosion. This technology is just absolutely out of the realm of imagination of, say, the Mechanicus and humanity at that time. But for the ships of the Golden Age, seemingly this is what they just had. So is it really too far of a stretch to consider that the Emperor could be both a perpetual who is known to be powerful to other perpetuals, but then later also some kind of immense ultimate collapsing human civilization Dark Age weapon gone wrong? Now, of course, those references to men of gold, although I think that's really a metaphor for just how humans saw themselves at that time. But what if it weren't? What if the golden men were in fact many constructed beings similar to what the Emperor would become, but that either failed or were not as powerful? What if the Emperor was not unique? What if he merely was the last remaining one of his kind, the most powerful superhuman weapon that ended the war with the Men of Iron, and that the Emperor stands as the last survivor? Kind of Highlander-esque. But now he's running on autopilot. Maybe he was something akin to being lost in the aftermath of that war, without a clear direction, wandering, and it was only when he met the Sigillites and Malcador that his vision and purpose became clear. And again, remembering of course what Malcador said. Quite honestly, the Emperor has always had something of an artificial autopilot feel to me. He seems entirely detached from the rest of humanity. He always wants to convince and have others feel that he's benevolent and that he has their best intentions at heart. He really seems to go out of his way to keep telling people that all the time. But I suppose arguably that could just be because he's so insanely powerful, his mind is working not just on another level but another plane of existence to everybody else. But this whole idea, it almost fits for me. It almost fits that concept of the weapon left out of its box running rampant. Maybe Malcador identified the Emperor at that time and recognised what he was, especially with the Sigillite Order hunting down technology, very well versed in knowing about ancient artefacts of humanity's past, including presumably from the Dark Age of technology. And again, remembering Malcador, as we noted, his order supposedly involved in these massive atrocities that were so severe they seemed to even shock Horus, but that, as we said in the last video, Malcador just brushes this off as being par for the course and a necessary evil essentially. So we're left, of course, undoubtedly wondering what was that all about. Perhaps those atrocities were Malcador and the Sigillites testing out the Emperor, that he'd recognised what the Emperor was, decided to put him to work, that together they embarked on a new plan, that this new age of the Imperium was far more Malcador than it was the Emperor. And it goes some way toward why, when things start to fall apart, the Emperor suddenly seems to draw a blank as to what comes next. Or, lastly today, to just go a step further, the Emperor is always claiming to just be a man, not an all-seeing, all-knowing, godlike being. But could he not be both? Originally a perpetual, a man, and also a godlike being. A human in the loosest sense possible during the ancient times, a powerful psyche to be sure, but somewhere during the Golden Age he sees an opportunity to harness more of the immense power humanity has achieved. But then the great collapse comes, the fall of humanity, and he is left adrift amidst a galaxy destroying itself. He's consigned to wait things out upon terror. The warp storms prevent any travel, and so he can only wait and bide his time until once again he may step out into the wider galaxy. Now I think this concept could go on and on. It gets somewhat into being a how long is a piece of string 40k speculative theory edition, but I think there's at least some small element of weight that you could put in this. It just depends on how willing you are to consider that some aspects of documented lore would have to be set aside to make things work. Either way, it's a very mentally engorging concept, and one I'll probably revisit in the future with perhaps a more lengthy forensic analysis. Now, there are of course always many speculations about the Emperor, but I feel sure there are also many speculations about others in the 40k verse, Xenos, individual figures, and so on. So feel free to explain your ideas in the comments below, as and when we get back to more speculative thinking in the future, I'll be sure to include a couple. Coming up soon, I've got plenty more 40k, a little dread opener, and yes, the apocalypse discussions will continue. I also want to do some miniature overviews, a couple of product things along the way, so much more coming up soon. Appreciate all your support as always, and if you want to contribute and support me further, check out my Patreon, the link is down below, and remember to keep an eye on the community tab from time to time for updates and polls to get involved in. I even started posting a few pictures of miniatures there because YouTube has seriously improved the community tab recently. Now I can post multiple pictures with polls and so on. And it's a great thing that I can use to share things with you all without necessarily using other socials. Although, if you want to check out my other socials, see that below as well. I often post on my Twitter and Instagram. Anyway, thanks for watching today, and as always, see you in the next one.